If the sun stayed dim for 18 months, the wheat would harden in the cold, the air would feel wrong on your skin, and whole harvests could vanish before anyone understood why. That is the opening of the 536 AD Dust Veil catastrophe. And it did not begin in a legend. It began in the weather people lived under. For years, tree rings kept the first record. They narrowed, season after season, showing a brutal cold snap that dragged on after the light failed. Then, in the ice at Colle Gnifetti, McCormick and Loveluck found volcanic glass from early 536. One clue in wood, one in ice, and both pointed to the same hidden event. What came next only deepened the case. If you like documentary mysteries like this, subscribe for the next chapter. That should have been enough to explain the darkness, but it wasn't. The ice core glass shards from Colle Gnifetti pointed toward an eruption early in 536, somewhere far enough north to spread its debris across a huge band of sky. It fit the first blow. It matched the dust veil. Yet the trees kept telling a harsher story than one burst of ash should easily explain. Their rings do not show a quick wound and recovery. They show the start of the coldest decade in roughly 2,000 years. Summers bitten by frost, growth pulled tight, harvests failing again. So the case widens. If one eruption opened the crisis, something else may have kept pressing down on the climate. And the next dates waiting in the record are 540 and 547. The dust veil did not lift cleanly. It seems to have sat over the world, then thickened again as fresh eruptions added their own load to the air. So the years after 536 matter so much. The record does not show one hard hit and then recovery. It shows pressure on top of pressure, with 540 and 547 keeping the climate locked inside the same cold, unstable spell. By then, the late antique Little Ice Age was no longer a theory. It was showing up in damaged seasons, in failed growing cycles, in the kind of weather that turns a bad year into a long one. And just when people needed stability most, the ground under daily life was already gone. Which makes the next arrival feel much worse. By the time the fields tried to recover, the damage had spread past weather. Grain stores ran thin, seed choices got harder, and every cold morning made the next harvest look smaller. This is where the volcanic sulfate spike stops being a lab result and starts looking like a human problem. In places tied to Rome's grain routes, hunger would not have felt abstract. It would have sounded like empty jars, tired mills, and people arguing over what little was left. So the catastrophe keeps moving, not as one blast, but as a chain reaction. And once the ground is already weak, something else can move in much faster than smoke. That faster threat arrives in 541. By then, the long chill had already done its work. Repeated crop failures do not just empty fields. They thin people out before any new crisis even appears. Hunger changes what bodies can withstand. It slows recovery, weakens whole communities, and turns one disaster into an opening for the next. So when the Justinianic plague enters the story, it does not step into a stable world. It moves across a population already strained by the years that began in 536, after the dimmed sun, the cold summers, and the bad harvests. That is what makes this event so severe. The sky breaks first, then the food system, then disease arrives. And now the question changes from what started it to how far the damage spread. And that spread is what makes this case so unsettling. The dimming was not pinned to one valley or one kingdom. The same event reaches across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, which means the failure in the sky was broad enough to disturb whole regions at once. Then the tree rings add the same message from another angle. This was the front edge of an unusually cold decade. not a single bad season. So the pattern hardens. First, the sun goes weak behind a haze. Then cold settles in. Then harvests begin to fail. Then, in 541, the Justinianic plague arrives among people already worn down. At that point, the mystery is no longer whether the crisis was real. It is that the first blow seems to come out of nowhere. That is where the evidence starts to lock together. At Colle Gnifetti in the Alps, the 2018 ice core work did not stand alone. The glass shards in the ice matched the timing of the dimming, while the tree rings kept pointing to the same cold turn. Two archives, two different materials, one ugly pattern. And that matters, because the 536 AD dust veil catastrophe is no longer just a story about bad weather. It is a forensic trail. One source says the sky was dim. Another says the years turned cold. Another says the atmosphere carried volcanic material. So now the question is not whether the record is real. It is which eruption left the first mark, and why the answer still slips away. That is where the evidence starts to lock together. At Colle Gnifetti in the Alps, the 2018 ice core work did not stand alone. The glass shards in the ice matched the timing of the dimming, while the tree rings kept pointing to the same cold turn. Two archives, two different materials, one ugly pattern. And that matters because the 536 AD dust veil catastrophe is no longer just a story about bad weather. It is a forensic trail. One source says the sky was dim. Another says the years turned cold. Another says the atmosphere carried volcanic material. So now the question is not whether the record is real. It is which eruption left the first mark, and why the answer still slips away. By then, the damage was no longer just in the sky or the fields. It had reached the body of the people living through it. The long cold, the failed harvests, the thin stores, all of it meant less strength, less margin, less room to survive the next blow. That is how the late antique Little Ice Age turns from climate into history. A weakened population does not just feel famine, it carries it forward. So when the plague moved in after 541, it found conditions that had already been stripped bare. The disaster did not arrive alone. It arrived after the ground had been emptied. And that is what makes the next question so hard. If the climate shock set the stage, what kind of eruption was strong enough to do that twice? So the plague did not just follow the cold, it followed weakness. In the cities and farms tied to Justinian's empire, the long pressure of the late antique Little Ice Age meant less food, less reserve, and fewer people standing when the next wave hit. That is the hard part of the record. The catastrophe was not one clean event. It was climate, then hunger, then disease. And that is why historians still hesitate to pin everything on a single eruption. The dust veil, the volcanic sulfate spike, the ice core glass shards, they all point back to the same broken year, but not yet to one simple culprit. Which leaves the real mystery hanging in the air. What was powerful enough to darken 3 continents, and how many times did it strike? One suspect still fits better than the rest: a high-latitude volcano. So the 2018 Colle Gnifetti study mattered. McCormick and Loveluck were not reading a story in words. They were reading glass shards in ice, and a volcanic sulfate spike that lined up with early 536. In a place like the Alps, that kind of trace is hard to fake. So the case tightens, but it does not close. The dust veil, the cold decade, the ruined seasons, the plague after 541, all of it points in one direction. And still, the record refuses to name the mountain. And that missing name is not a small problem. It is the center of the mystery. A volcano can explain the haze, the cooling, and the first shock in 536. It can also fit the later blows around 540 and 547. But the evidence is stronger on sequence than on identity. The climate record is clear. The criminal lineup is not. So the event has to be handled carefully. Saying one eruption did everything sounds neat, but the record itself resists that kind of tidy answer. The 536 AD dust veil catastrophe looks more like stacked damage, one strike, then another, until the cold settles into history. So the science is left in an awkward place. It knows the weapon, but not yet the hand that swung it. That is the part that keeps the case open. A high-latitude volcano fits the spread of the haze, and the 2018 ice core work keeps pulling the same way. But fit is not proof, and the record still won't hand over a clean name. The 536 AD dust veil catastrophe leaves behind timing, ash, and cooling, not a signature. So the scientific picture stays careful. One eruption may have started it, then the later years piled on with more forcing. So the story is stronger as a chain than as a single blow. And for all that certainty about the sequence, the final blank is still there, the mountain itself. And so the written record feels thin beside it. Chroniclers saw the dimness, but they did not have the tools to track the air itself. The real witnesses were the rings in old trees, the glass shards in the Alps, and the slow cold locked into later years. Those archives do not speak loudly, but they do not drift either. So the case against the sky keeps tightening without ever becoming neat. The history is there, the climate is there, the damage is there, and the mountain still refuses to step into the light. Which leaves one last question hanging over the whole thing. If the world was changed this hard, why did so few people write it down? So the written record feels so thin beside it. Procopius, John of Ephesus, and other 6th century writers left scraps, not a full diagnosis. They could describe darkness, cold, and fear, but not measure the air that carried it. Their world had no way to name a dust veil the way the ice and trees later did. So the human archive stays local and partial, while the natural one keeps the wider pattern. That split is the whole problem here, and it leaves the final gap untouched. If the sky changed the world this hard, why does the mountain still refuse to say its name? And that silence tells its own story. People in 536 could feel the cold on their hands, see the pale light, watch fields fail. But they could not compare tree rings across continents or cut through alpine ice. They lived inside the event without any way to see its full shape. What looked like separate local troubles was, in fact, one connected atmospheric crisis. That is the strange reversal at the heart of this case. The humans had the fear, the hunger, the dim sky. The archives had the memory. So when modern science rebuilds the sequence, 536, then 540, then 547, then 541's plague pressing into a weakened world, it is not discovering a legend. It is finally reading a record the witnesses themselves could not read. And once you see it that way, the event changes shape. It is not just a dark sky in 536. It is the first line of a long receipt. Dimmed sun, then cold, then failed harvests, then the pressure of the late antique Little Ice Age, then the plague entering a population already thinned by hunger. McCormick and Loveluck did not uncover a single dramatic moment in the Alps. They helped expose a sequence. So this catastrophe feels so modern to the mind, even though it belongs to late antiquity. Systems fail in layers. One shock weakens the next defense. By the time people know the scale of it, the damage is already distributed everywhere. And the strangest part is still waiting at the end of the trail. So the case ends without a culprit in chains. No chronicler in 536 could point to the mountain. Procopius could not, John of Ephesus could not. Justinian's empire could only endure the dim light, the bad summers, the hunger, and what followed. The full shape of the disaster had to wait inside alpine ice, inside rings laid down one thin season at a time, inside the long shadow of the late antique Little Ice Age. That is the hard grandeur of it. A gray sky passed overhead, and the cleanest testimony was filed where no court of the time could open it. High on Colle Gnifetti, the snow kept falling. Layer over layer, it covered the ash, sealed the year, and stayed quiet.